Ani Kinawaya, Onkadans Indigena Cas, Maingan Nedodem, Chippewas, Georgina Island, and Donjaba, Nishnabe, and Dow, meanwhile, Joganoshwan, Nuswan, Duncan McHugh. Hi, everyone. My name is Duncan McHugh. I am a professor at the School of Journalism here at Carleton University. And welcome to this very important discussion that we're having tonight called Understanding Israel Palestine in the Shadow of War. We have two fabulous guests who are going to walk us through this terrain and teach us and share with us. But before we get started, I want to turn this discussion over to Dean Brenda O'Neill, who is, of course, the Dean of Public Affairs here at Carleton, to start off our evening.
Thank you so much, Duncan. I appreciate it. I want to first just say thank you to everyone who is joining us this evening. It's certain to be an interesting and an informative discussion, but I also want to say it's going to be an important one. I want to start tonight's event by providing a land acknowledgement. And the purpose of land acknowledgements is really to both acknowledge but also honor the people and the treaty agreements and unceded lands of Turtle Island. So I'd like to suggest I always say that we should do this with intention, but also do it with some reflection. And so I want to acknowledge that the land on which we gather to present this webinar tonight is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I don't want to take up too much time. I want us to get going, but I do very much want to set the tone for this evening's event. I know that we're all aware that the topic can be and is a very difficult one for many people for a number of reasons on both sides, regardless of our beliefs and our positions. But this is exactly the task that I think we face in democracies. It's figuring out how to be able to discuss topics on issues on which we take completely opposing sides and positions. We can't eliminate those differences, and so I think it's imperative that we choose to discuss these issues with civility. And I think universities are exactly the places for setting this kind of an example. Not only do I think it's the exact kind of place, but I think this is where we must learn to set the example for having these kinds of challenging conversations, for being respectful of each other's humanity, for challenging beliefs without challenging the person. I don't think we can avoid these conversations. I think holding our tongue isn't an answer, but I think we have to and must be able to have the conversations about topics, particularly those that we're most passionate about, while also respecting the very people that we disagree with. So I'm going to ask each and every one joining us tonight to keep this in mind, listen with intention, think about what you're hearing, digest what you're hearing, think about that before you decide to speak and question with respect to everyone joining us tonight, and I would say especially those that you disagree with. Let us be an example. So thank you, and I very much hope you enjoy tonight's webinar.
Thank you so much, Dean O'Neill, and I want to echo that those words that you shared in terms of respect. It's such an important principle of the Indigenous community that I come from, that you be conscious of the words that you're sharing with people, and that words have impact. So we have a Q&A feature here, and we are welcome. Our guests are quite happy to answer your question, and so please do feel free to throw any questions that you may have into the Q&A feature. I will keep my eye on that throughout the talk this evening, and from time to time we'll lob questions at them. Let me introduce you to the folks that we have on the screen who we're going to spend the next hour and 15 minutes with. Mira Sucharov is a professor of political science here at Carleton University in Ottawa. She specializes in teaching about Israel and Palestine, and she's the author most recently of Borders and Belonging, a memoir. Omar Dajani is the co-director of the Global Center for Business and Development at the McGeorge School of Law, which is at the University of the Pacific in Sacramento, California. And he served as a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in peace talks with Israel. So two folks that have spent a lot of time thinking about Our topic this evening, Understanding Israel Palestine in the Shadow of War. We're going to be talking about conversations about the past, present, and future of Israel and Palestine, and I guess importantly for those of us here in North America, how we can talk about the challenges in the region. So Mira and Omar, welcome to this webinar.
Thank you,
Thank
Duncan.
you.
Um, it's been months now since October 7th, and so I just want to start off, and both of you are so closely tied to the region. I just want to start off by asking how you're doing. Omar, let me start with you.
It's hard to fathom that it's been 5 months. Tomorrow will be 5 months since October 7th, and that the carnage continues and shows no signs of abating. I was reading this morning that over the last 24 hours, another 86 people, 86 Palestinians in Gaza were killed in IDF strikes. And that brings the number to well over 30,000 civilians killed during this time. That big number is hard to swallow. And I think that it's hard to imagine as well. When we talk about numbers of that kind, very quickly they can seem abstract, theoretical. And I think what I'm struggling to do, and it makes me feel anguished and angry and guilty that it is a struggle, is to continue to think of that large number as a number comprised of the deaths of a lot of individual people. And so I guess the demons tormenting me these days, Duncan, are guilt and anguish and anger and impotence. And I think particularly from here in the United States, in a context where our unfolding election year yields so few opportunities to transform policy in a place that matters as much to me as Israel Palestine does, that adds another layer of challenge to all of this.
I've got questions for you, Omar, just about how you deal with that guilt and that anger. But let me ask the same question to Mira as well. Omar shared his thoughts on the impact on the Palestinian people. Obviously, Mira, this has had huge impacts for Jewish folks as well. How are you doing?
Yeah, and of course, I am a Canadian Jew and a professor here at Carleton, and Omar's a Palestinian American, and we'll talk a little bit about how that comes into play in our ongoing research partnership and friendship. For me, I look both at, and I know Omar does too, at Israelis and Palestinians, and what is the degree of suffering and trauma that is happening across that quasi border. Of course, we're not talking about two separate states. It's important for people to realize that Gaza is not an independent state. So this isn't like a Russia and Ukraine situation, except for the degree of human suffering and trauma it is. So first, I'm also horrified by the increasing bloodshed and Israel's policy of mass starvation. And I'm very conscious of also not wanting to compound the trauma of my Israeli family and friends. And so I'm doing a lot on social media, a lot of public talks, and I'm aware that my primary audience isn't Israelis. Because I'm sort of a little bit awkward. I feel a little bit like it's not necessarily my place to tell them what to do, except in one instance. In one instance, when we've seen recent polls showing the degree upwards beyond 93%, I think up to 94% of Israeli Jews in this poll who support the degree of force being used in Gaza. That is very alarming. And so I know that some of my family and friends there are among that tiny 6% outlier, and then others aren't. So that's sort of the balancing act I'm trying to do right now, is think about how I can be a voice of moral clarity. And of course, some people listening to this would say that Sucharov is not a voice of moral clarity at all. So we'll unpack that and what that even means to people, but trying to bring a scholarly understanding of what's happening and informed by international law, and keep the facts straight and help people get through this time.
And again, I will come back to this. I am very curious to know how you are straddling those two positions and the conversations that you have. But let's lay the groundwork here for our audience, and just, you mentioned the friendship. You have had an incredible friendship and productive working relationship. And I'd love to know how that started. Mira, let me ask you first.
I kept, and this will be good for the graduate students and junior faculty among us in the audience, I kept getting book rejections. The editors would be excited about my book idea. I mean, I have published a bunch of books as well, but at this point in 2021, I had another book idea, kept getting rejected. Editors liked it, peer reviewers were mixed. And I realized it's time to bring in a Palestinian voice. It's time to collaborate across the aisle, so to speak. And I think I'm ready at this point in my career to have my voice enriched by a Palestinian, and rather than have them be simply the object, who I'm writing about, really bring them in as an active voice in my collaborations. And I reached out to Omar during the last active conflict between Israel and Hamas. It was turned out to be on a much smaller scale than it is now, than what's going on now, but it was equally it felt alarming at the time, and that was in May 2021. And Omar and I had been Facebook friends for some years. We're in common intellectual scholarly networks with some common friends. So I had seen his posts, and at this point in May 2021, Omar wrote what I thought was a very both educational and moving post about how the Gaza Strip came to be. And it was centered on both the historical and factual context of who lives in the Gaza Strip and what their needs and desires are, and the history of the Gaza Strip, but it also focused on Omar's own family story. Omar's father, when he was 16, was driven out of Jaffa, which at the time was the most populous Palestinian city. And in April 1948, over the course of 2 weeks, the city emptied out of almost its entire 70,000 plus Palestinian population. And Omar is now the son of a refugee because of that. And I was really touched by how he brought in the personal element and the scholarly, legal, political element. And I shared it with my followers. And what's very usual in my case is I get a lot of pushback from many of my followers. And I just kept the conversation going. And Omar and I became friends from then on.
Omar, what did you think when I mean, you were Facebook friends, but what did you think when Mira, who writes about Israel, reached out to you to ask to collaborate?
Well, so I should say at the outset that in that exchange in May of 2021, what touched me was that I had posted something that told a profoundly personal story, and she had folks from her network who were raising a lot of hard questions. And Mira was defending me, defending my story, defending the Palestinian narrative in ways that touched me, particularly in view of the fact that we didn't really know each other. And so when a few months later, she reached out to me and said, "Hey, would you have an interest in maybe writing a book together?" Even though my first vociferous reaction was no, because I had just finished a book project and was not keen to start a new one. I was intrigued by the possibility of collaboration. And I suggested at the time that we explore doing a podcast together, something that I had been thinking about and that I thought might be a means of reaching a younger and broader audience, and a means also of exploring the history of Israel Palestine in a way that enabled us to go back and forth between narratives and engage a range of different voices. And she was intrigued. And so we had a good discussion about it. But I'll say a last thing on that front, which was that, maybe two last things, if I may. The first was that I realized in our early discussion that Mira was also really trying to suss me out, to determine where my convictions lay, to make sure that I was someone who stood for the same kinds of values that she did, and whose politics weren't too compromised, even with regard to Israel Palestine. And I realized that maybe subtly I did the same thing. And the second thing I'd say is that we, well before October 7th, a good couple of years before, we had occasion, before we'd actually met in person, to work on an article together in which we were corresponding as our selves at an earlier point in our lives about Zionism. And it was a kind of a creative nonfiction project. But what we were able to do was to have a conversation on paper about a hard topic, with a little bit of distance, not just from the paper, but also because it was our earlier innocent selves who were conversing. And that enabled us to talk about some very difficult things, to be kind of blunt with each other. And I think that strengthened our capacity later on to have hard conversations and to get through them.
And you talk about the hard conversations that you would end up having as putting together the book, putting together the podcast. I wonder, as you started to have those conversations, Omar, was there what surprised you?
You know, I think that there are a few things. So first of all, if you look closely at our respective political commitments, I think that they're difficult to distinguish from each other. And what I've learned over a lot of conversation that we see the future of Israel Palestine in pretty similar terms. We operate, as I indicated earlier, from a set of similar values. Even our views about the political parties that we think should prevail, whether in Canada or in the US or in Israel Palestine, are pretty similar. And so there is a lot of similarity on that front, but it obscures a difference in experience that can come out in significant ways. Mira, as I'm sure she'll tell us more about, grew up with a deep attachment to Israel, and an attachment that was rooted not only, as maybe we Palestinians can sometimes imagine, in a kind of indoctrination by family, but instead also by deep experience, by the kinds of identity issues that so many of us have, a seeking of a place that could feel like home, a way to find mooring in a shaky world, particularly as an adolescent. And all of these many experiences produced attachments that are just really different than my own. And so when we started taking trips to Israel Palestine together, I realized that as we would walk down the sidewalk, our emotional reactions to what we would see differed. I would get angry about things, things that were not obvious sources of anger. For example, this spectacular park that is built on the waterfront in the city of Jaffa, where my family comes from. Seeing that park gets me exercised because I know that park sits on rubble of houses like the house that my family once built. And it's not that Mira is insensitive to those things, but her reflex when we're in those places is to see Israel through a place of love, through a place of connection. And just that starting point creates occasional tensions and difficulties. So I'll maybe leave it at that for now, but maybe Mira would like to elaborate.
Omar raised an important word there, indoctrination, and I wonder, Mira. I mean, I could sense that you were hesitant to reach out across the divide, as you said, when you were looking for a partner. So for you, what kind of surprises did you encounter as you got to know Omar?
I think okay, I'm going to say something kind of nuanced. So I'm comfortable debating, and I do that a lot on social media, as anyone who follows me knows, and you're always welcome to follow my many public posts. Facebook is my favorite platform these days because I'm of the older generation, and that's where we tend to hang out. And but when it happens with Omar that we fall into a political debate, which certainly is not outside of the remit of our intended work together, nevertheless, I find that I crumple. So, what I have come to experience is that I experience Omar as more self than other. And unlike a garden variety political rival who might exist out in my social media world, or if I were at a protest and there was a counter protester there, I might relish the debate with a political rival. With Omar, I don't. And that has been something I've had to contend with, because there are times where our work depends on hashing some things out. And I find that I find that very emotionally taxing to do. And that surprised me.
So, and then October 7th rolls along. And so you're, it's one thing to say that you don't look at each other as other, but that must have, Omar talked about the tensions. I'm curious as to how your friendship dealt with October 7th. Mira, let me start with you.
So at first it was relatively easy because in the early hours of October 7th, the direction of violence was very clear. And what Hamas did was very clear. I mean, they did two things. They attacked soldiers. In addition to that, they attacked civilians. And the majority of the 1,200 casualties that day out of Israel were civilians. And Omar and I could be united, and were united instinctively that morning, in condemning Hamas's attacks on civilians and the taking of hostages. And what helped as well was Omar already had friends in Israel even before he met me, but he hadn't spent very much time until he met me around the Gaza area. And Israelis call those kibbutzim, the agricultural villages near the Gaza fence. They call that the Gaza envelope. And we had spent a few days together there just last summer at my kibbutz family's house. And Omar had been given the secure room to sleep in, and I'd been given a room down the hall. And my kibbutz parents, that when I say a kibbutz family, just quick briefer, when I was 20 and did a junior year abroad at the Hebrew University, I had a family that sponsored me on a kibbutz, and they sort of took me in as a second family, or they took me in as a sort of a quasi-daughter, and that was common among North American Jews who were seeking a connection with the kibbutz. So I have a lot of friends who still are in touch with their families from this kibbutz and the one nearby. So they later moved to a kibbutz even closer to the Gaza Strip, and that's where we spent a few nights in last July. And so when I called Omar and I said that my kibbutz family had been holed up in their secure room, hearing Hamas militants outside and narrowly escaped being taken hostage, and they're traumatized right now. And a few hours later, I had to tell Omar that now Eli, my kibbutz dad, has a bullet in his hand that won't be removable because the IDF thought he and his wife Yonit were Hamas militants as they were driving out of the kibbutz to shelter a few hours later. Omar not only knew them, had a relationship with them, but had slept in that very room that's known as the secure room that most Israelis have, if they can afford one. So it created a sense of united between Omar and I, where we were united in being revolted by the attacks on civilians. But then things got more complicated.
Omar, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. So, I'll start by saying that, even though I'd spent a lot of time inside the Gaza Strip, had worked there for the UN, as Mira noted, I hadn't spent time in the Israeli communities that surround it. And so it did resonate. I experienced October 7th emotionally very differently as a result of having spent those days with her than I would have otherwise. And indeed, one person that we had breakfast with, Vivian Silver, was initially we thought taken hostage, but it turned out was among those murdered on October 7th. And so it had profound personal resonance for us on that front. But within 24 hours, Israel began its assault on the Gaza Strip. And that assault, as we all know, has continued to this day. And while Mira and I, again, were united in our disgust by the punitive quality of the IDF's actions, by the scale of civilian death that the IDF's tactics, its operations on the ground, was resulting in. Differences in the way in which we saw events unfolded started to emerge, and I'll give one example, but I think there are a few that we might talk about over the course of this conversation. So one example of kind of a difference that emerged was in relation to the allegations of sexual violence on October 7th. As many folks will know, there were allegations which the United Nations, as well as the government of Israel and the New York Times, have all said are substantiated of rapes and other horrific violence being inflicted upon women on October 7th. That those things occurred was something that we had both read about. But Mira, who, as she noted, is often on Facebook and engages a lot with folks on Facebook, texted me in December, noting that she had posted the New York Times piece talking about the sexual violence, and that folks, including one of my family members, had challenged her on it, and that what she framed as denialism on that front was really troubling to her. And my reaction to what she wrote in that text was a bit ambivalent. I sent back kind of a cringe emoji initially. And it was ambivalent because whereas on the one hand, I didn't doubt that there had been sexual violence, I felt that the way in which it was being framed in the New York Times piece was likely to elicit even more rage, and particularly in view of the fact that Israeli officials and Israeli soldiers were already expressing genocidal intentions, framing their actions in profoundly dehumanizing ways. I was fearful about the way in which this New York Times piece, which presented some first-person narratives in sensational detail, the way in which that might feed the violence in that moment. So I was very apprehensive about that. And I also felt that as I read through the piece, that it didn't seem as well substantiated as I expected New York Times journalism to be. The accounts were derived from single-person testimony without evidence from others, and I mean the anecdotal accounts. And as I read them, I thought, oh, this doesn't feel true to me, and I felt that the way in which the testimony was, the reporting was laid out, left too much oblique, and so in all of this, I'm kind of struggling because I understand how important it is to believe women when they allege sexual violence against them. And I know how hard, I understood how hard Mira was taking this, and the ways in which denialism in particular looms large for Jewish people. But I also felt how important it was to read critically the news reports that were coming out about what was unfolding and continuing to unfold in that moment. And so all of this together produced an ambivalent reaction, which I think Mira then took as me kind of sawing off the limb that she had walked out on. Here she was, someone who was entering into a lot of arguments with other members of her own community about events as they were unfolding in the Gaza Strip and how to read them. And what she was seeing from me was, in relation to this episode, that I was not there supporting her. And so it was one context in which the level of trust between us personally, our respective emotional reactions to what was unfolding, and our fears about what might be still to come all converged to make for an argument that, to be honest, has continued almost to this day, although I think it's just in the last few days that we've kind of found some common ground with regard to that episode.
I see you nodding there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of nodding, kind of probably unconsciously saying, haven't we made up yet? Haven't we made up yet? I thought we had. But yes, the debate still resurfaces, and there's new takedowns from the alternative press trying to poke holes in the New York Times reporting. And so, I mean, this was something we could talk, I'm sure, a lot with you about, Duncan, as a journalism professor, in terms of what is to be viewed as correct. And I tend to view legacy media as legitimate until proven otherwise. And that's my instinct. But again, that's another question about sourcing.
And there have been questions raised about the Times piece, but before I just wonder if I could take a step back for a second. I mean, you talk about shared values and the fact that you wanted to collaborate. I wonder, prior to October 7th, when you started to go back to Israel, what kind of reactions would you get from people when you sat down together and introduced the work you were attempting to do? Yeah.
You know, for me, a lot of it. So with the trips we've taken to Israel, Palestine, we've taken 4 together, and we have a 5th planned in the coming months. And the idea is to show each other people and places that are meaningful to us, and we're meant to represent, showing the reader how Jews and Palestinians can live together better than they're living together now, but that can't happen until there's a real, authentic reckoning with the emotional experience of feeling connected to that place. And so we're trying to come from a sense of mutual honoring of connection, rather than what we see all too often in social media or everyday discourse, where one group is trying to delegitimize the connection of the other group to the area. So it's the idea of mutual uplifting. We have some future visions in mind of what that might look like. We could get to that later. But so I would take Omar, and I would notice, so we might meet with some friends of mine who made their life in Israel in the wave of the 1960s, 1970s immigration. And I would sort of be watching as Omar engaged with them, what brought you, and what brought you from America to Israel, let's say, and I'm sort of hoping that they'll make a connection. And knowing that Omar is very sort of suspicious of, in a sense, I shouldn't speak for Omar, but my sense is that Omar's a little bit suspicious. What does this mean to enact American Jewish privilege and come and add to the Jewish privilege that already exists? You're not, he might say to the person sitting across from us, you're not a Holocaust survivor. You weren't kicked out of a country in the Arab world. You came from privilege in Northern California. What makes you land here? So that's a question too, because years ago, I would have never questioned them. In fact, I thought I might make my life in Israel when I was in my 20s. And I never thought of it in terms of tipping the scales of Jewish privilege. I always thought that I would come and help make the country better. So some of those little moments I've noticed.
What kind of reactions did you get, Omar? I was struck by you staying in the safe room when you were on the visit to the kibbutz, and I just wonder what it's like for you as a Palestinian engaged in the work that you're doing with Mira.
Yeah, it's complicated. So it's complicated whether we're visiting Israeli Jews or we're visiting Palestinians. And so, yes, when we were at her kibbutz family's home, it was strange to me to recognize that I was the only Palestinian around. I mean, it turns out there were some workers who work on the kibbutz who were close by, whom I hadn't been introduced to. but it was uh, recognizing the Gaza Strip was a couple of kilometers away, millions of Palestinians literally right there, but that I was in that space with Mira's family, having conversations where we were negotiating our way toward talking about some difficult issues, grappling with, for example, what happened in 1948. I mean, we spent one afternoon at another kibbutz in which we were having coffee with some friends of her families, and we had this wide-ranging conversation about 1948 and how each of them perceived it, and it was in some ways really fortifying, because it was striking how many different perspectives there were. There was, on the one hand, one person who was sort of very emphatically saying, we've tried to put that out of our minds. We've tried to move past that. There's no point in, rehashing what happened before. They should be where they are, and we should be where we are, and that should be the end of it. Kind of the opposite of the spirit of the land acknowledgement that y'all gave at the beginning of this talk. On the other hand, there was a guy there who confessed that he had no idea about the Nakba until in his 60s. He had decided to finish college and took a course at a community college, and in which he learned the history, and it opened up opportunities for him, or a desire in him, to find out what had happened on the land where the place where he was living was. And so it was strange and frustrating and moving to sort of be a part of all of those conversations in that living room, in that place of privilege, with green lawns all around us, very different from what exists on the other side of the Gaza Strip. And then conversely, we spent time with my Palestinian friends in places like Ramallah and Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and with people that we met together in Jaffa, and there was a tricky dynamic, because folks in that place engage in a lot of what's the word to use? Kind of people are always attempting to try to read your politics from all sorts of signals that you give, try to place you, to situate you. People come into every interaction with a lot of assumptions, and it is a very deeply divided place, which I guess is not a great insight, but is something that you don't realize until you go there. And so, we would be sitting at a table, and I would be paying attention to the dynamics. How are my friends reacting to Mira? What do they think about the way in which she's telling that story? What do they think about the fact that she just put threw a Hebrew phrase into a sentence that she was using? And indeed, some of my friends, not having had the long conversations that we've had about what has been, what should be, would ask me questions like, is Mira a Zionist? What does she see as the future? Does she believe in Palestinians' right of return? All of these questions. And I think knowing that happened also would make Mira feel uncomfortable and vulnerable. So it's a complicated negotiation at every juncture.
You're talking about these really difficult conversations. One of the reasons I was so pleased that Dean Brenda O'Neill asked me to do this is that, of course, there should be no better place to have these kinds of difficult conversations than our university campuses, in Canada and in the United States. But as we've seen, these have become very contested battlegrounds in many ways. I'm curious to know your thoughts. You're both professors. What you think about campus activism, the general dynamics of the conversation around October 7th and what's happened in the past few months. Mira.
My comments are going to be intended more generally to campuses across North America. What I say shouldn't mean to single out Carleton or be specific about Carleton. I just wanted to say that. And so one thing that troubles me in campus dynamics, and this is something that Omar and I try very hard to overcome in our interactions with each other. One thing that troubles me in campus dynamics is the mutual diminishing of each side's pain. And so, for example, when one side tears down hostage posters, that feels to me like what's the word when a movie's got too much violence? Extraneous. There's a special word for it. It seems to me
Gratuitous.
gratuitous. It seems to me like a gratuitous act of diminishing the other side's pain. Similarly, when the other side views in the most uncharitable terms, uncharitable interpretations, Palestinian slogans of freedom, so that if people are chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, and the other side assumes that that means genocide or ethnic cleansing of Jews, rather than being curious and reading sources and reading what Palestinians mean by it. And there's a lot of literature on what it means. I'm not saying that there isn't a debate to be had, but the assumption of bad faith on the other side is what troubles me a lot. And so it's the brittleness of the discourse that's troubling. I mean, in a way, it's not really on the other hand, but I guess at the same time, college, university is the time to exercise your political muscles and learn to use your voice. And I know that when I was 18, 19, I was also learning that, and I don't know if I always did it in the most perfectly effective manner. So I don't want to sort of I don't want to act like the old fogey sort of saying, oh, kids these days, and they don't know anything. So I think we also have to be charitable that students are learning the way, learning to find their way. But at the same time, I do have hopes for how we can speak more effectively across these divides.
And if any of our audience has any questions, you're welcome to share them. I will keep my eye on the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom there. Throw them in there, and I will start to lob them out. I've still got lots of questions, so I'm not going to start sharing them yet. But please do enter your questions, and I'll try to share them with Omar and Mira as we go along. I asked about campuses, Omar. I mean, I can't. The chill after the president of the University of Pennsylvania, the Harvard president, testified in front of Congress, and then we saw the fallout of their attempt to talk about what was happening on their campuses. What are your observations about the state of the conversation or the debate that's going on in campuses in the United States?
So I'd like to say three things about it. The first is that I think I've rarely seen Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students feeling so vulnerable as they do in the current moment. And I think that is a function of a lot of different things. It's a function of the fact that on many campuses, students have been punished for their speech and have been censured in a range of censored in a range of different ways. And I think that's left a lot of students unsure where the lines are separating what is acceptable and what isn't. And I think that creates vulnerability. The fact that there have been students who, like the three young Palestinian students who were shot in Burlington, Vermont, after coming from a demonstration, deepens that sense of vulnerability. So I think that's a very significant piece. And I just got a call the other day from a student who was worried about what her legal situation was likely to be in view of things that she had said. And we have been engaging with law firms lately. And as as a law professor, I'm very deeply aware of the fact that some law firms have revoked their offers of employment to students who had expressed solidarity with Palestinians or taken a position about what happened on October 7th. So vulnerability, I think, is an important part of what's happening. Secondly, I think that we do need to find ways of providing more rather than less context for the things that we do say. I think there is a lot, of course, to be said for protests, and demonstrations play a hugely important role. And in a moment like this one, where avenues for challenging policy through, for example, primary elections are closed off by the lack of options that the political process affords, you can see the need for protest. But I also see how crucial it is that folks provide more context, provide more explanation than a slogan typically allows. And I think too often on campuses, we end up sort of speaking too briefly rather than at adequate length. And that brings me to my last point, which is that, and maybe this is because I'm American and I'm a constitutional law professor, but whereas I do think that we need to privilege civility, I think that we need to privilege more freedom. And in terms of the discourse on campuses, in a moment like this, in view of the stakes, I think university administrations need to ensure that students have opportunities to vent their concerns about policies that they feel are morally bankrupt. And I think there's been on many university campuses, on the part of many university administrations, too much restrictiveness on that front.
You mentioned context, Omar, and I wonder. There's one of our audience members, Maya, has a question. It's been my experience in my journalism classrooms that my students are quite eager to tackle the topic journalistically, and that's great. The challenge for me as a journalism professor is unpacking some of the words that work their way into their student journalistic work, such as apartheid, such as genocide. Maya, one of our audience members, has a question about that word genocide. How do Omar and Mira feel about using the term genocide about what's happening in Gaza? I'd love to just hear your thoughts on unpacking a couple of those terms. I'm not going to ask the law prof that question first because we could be here for a while. So Mira, what do you think about that term genocide?
So the good thing about a question that asks about those specific terms is that those terms, unlike some other controversial terms, let's say like settler colonialism, the terms apartheid and genocide are codified in international law. So it becomes easier to say, well, let's look at the definitions together. In fact, I was at a dinner party the other night with some Israeli friends of friends, and we pulled up the definition of genocide, and Omar and I were discussing it just earlier today. And part of the problem is that it's very, very, very broad because it talks about destruction of a population in whole or in part, and it doesn't specify what part, what percentage of the population needs to be destroyed needs to be killed or murdered in order for it to classify as genocide. But the key point with the genocide charge is it rests on intent. And so when I look at the what South Africa brought to the ICJ, to the International Court of Justice, by way of bringing charges against Israel. Remember, one country can bring charges against another country if they're both members of the ICJ, and that's what happened there. And when they brought the charge of genocide against Israel, their testimony had to establish intent. And I think they did a reasonable case of doing that, a reasonable job of doing that. Now it will rest with the judges. But what I do know is, what I do feel confident in saying is that there have been genocidal statements by Israeli elected officials. And that's coupled with two other things: Israel's policy of mass starvation. And Israel advocates will say, no, Israel is not intending to starve the population. Instead, Hamas is diverting it. But I don't think there's sufficient grounds to believe that Hamas is diverting food aid in any significant way. And secondly, we know that Israel deployed a full siege right on October 7th and 8th of the Gaza Strip. And so by the time that it softened the siege and started letting aid trucks in, the amount coming in every day is not enough. It's a fraction of what is necessary to sustain the Palestinian population. And there's other things going on as well that we can get into. So I think that it is reasonable to call it genocide. I think it's not certain whether it's genocide. And so I think in that way, I would say I agree with people who use it and people who don't use it, if that's enough of a fence-sitting answer. What I don't agree with is people who feel that not using it is absolutely wrong, or people who feel that using the term is absolutely wrong.
One of the challenge of using it in the context of a journalistic piece is that, of course, there is a very technical definition, which requires a fair amount of explanation, and you only have so many words in a news piece or a radio piece. Omar, how do you respond when the term genocide comes up?
I think that there's, Mira and I'll trade places. She offered kind of the legal framework, and I think the legal framework is important. But I think that when people are using genocide these days to describe what's happening in Gaza, what they're also trying to do is to speak in a shorthand about the carnage that is unfolding. And so I think what people are saying, so this is a different question than whether a journalism student should use it in an article or how a journalism student should use it in an article. But when people say you've got these manifold expressions of genocidal intent from senior government officials and from soldiers on the ground and from on TikTok and Reels, regular Israelis, and you combine that with the kinds of practices that Mira just pointed to, and the scale of death, which is unprecedented in the 21st century and rarely seen in recent years. Genocide as a term seems to fit. Now, of course, legally we'll have to get to intent, but do I blame people for raising it? No. And do I think that there is a plausible case that that's exactly what's happening? Absolutely.
Mira raised another term, and I'm a Anishinaabe, and amongst my circle, the conversation often that comes up is the term that Mira raised, settler colonialism, and I wonder again if I'll start with you, Omar. How do you navigate the use of that term in this debate?
So I think that with regard to settler colonialism, one has to sort of think about in whose based on whose experience that term is being considered, right? And so in terms of how Palestinians have experienced Zionism and the creation of Israel, it's hard to think of a frame that is better than settler colonialism, because the Palestinian experience has been one of a population facing from the 1890s forward a colonial enterprise, European Jews settling in their land, settling with a view toward establishing separate institutions, moving toward the creation of a state that disenfranchised the local population, and through a range of different policies that are very reminiscent of what we see in North America, reminiscent of what we've seen in Australia, in French Algeria. We see disenfranchisement, dispossession, and the denial of self-determination. So from the Palestinian perspective, it makes perfect sense. When we look at the conflict, the situation Israel-Palestine more broadly, though, when you back away and think about it from the perspective of Jewish experience, I think the lens changes. And so if you're thinking about it in terms of the experience of Jews in the early 20th century, seeking a place of sanctuary, unlike other colonial enterprises, being folks who didn't always have a place to return to. And in addition, feeling a sense of connection to place, then some of the other frames as a national conflict, as a struggle over individual rights and a struggle for Jewish self-determination also come into play. And so I think it's an appropriate label, but I think it is not the only label that is appropriately used in this context.
If I could ask, and I'm just sharing another question from one of our audience members, Mira, related to this discussion about settler colonialism. Dominique Marshall asks, do you find the vocabulary in terms of the difficult discussions over truth and reconciliation here in Canada helpful for your own thinking, and for some promise that Canadians who don't know the Middle East might understand what is happening in the Middle East better? For those who are trying to understand what's going on there, who may not have had the opportunity to go to Israel Palestine, is that lens of settler colonialism and the truth and reconciliation that we're project that we're embarked on here in Canada, is that a helpful frame of reference?
I think it can be very helpful. Now it's a little too it's two sides of a sharp sword here. I once used it in an article back when I had a regular column in the National Canadian Jewish paper, which no longer exists in the same form. I brought up the parallels between the Israel Palestine experience and Indigenous settler relations in Canada. And I thought that would calm my audience who find my criticisms of Israel overbaked. I thought it would calm them because I would be saying, well, I'm not asking Israel to do anything different than I'm asking my own country to do vis-a-vis the Indigenous population. But it backfired, and people got very, very threatened by it, and that became the end of my column. But and I think also is because the word occupation appeared in the headline, and that hadn't happened before, and people got very threatened about the word occupation. We're not even debating that anymore. So I think the key thing is this: when we talk about settler colonialism in Israel, we are talking more like Canada, the US, New Zealand, Australia than we are about Algeria. So a decolonized Israel won't and shouldn't imply pushing Jews out of Israel. That would be ethnic cleansing. And so, for instance, in Montreal, I don't want to say which university it was because I don't want to get it wrong, but an instructor at one of the universities in the city of Montreal apparently, what I recall, yelled at a Jewish student, saying, go back to where you came from. That is very threatening, offensive, anti-Semitic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So no one is calling for Jews to leave, or if they are, that is not what Omar and I advocate at all. The idea of the settler colonial idea is to look at the structures of power that keep one ethnic group elevated at the expense of another ethnic group. And that can come in terms of policies, discriminatory policies. It can come, as it often does in the West Bank, in terms of land expropriation, expansion of settlements in the West Bank. And it can come from Israel's Israel's having barred since 1948 Palestinians returning. So that's also what makes it different from Canada, US, New Zealand, Australia, as we're talking about a refugee situation, that refugees have not been allowed to return into Israel. So there are some differences. But again, I value what Omar says in that it isn't the full story, because the full story also involves a sense of competing nationalisms. It involves Jews taking themselves seriously, joining the world stage as a nation like all others who tried to get a state and succeeded. And it doesn't take into account even competing notions of indigeneity. So in a typical settler colonial lens, there's one indigenous group, even though it is comprised of multiple nations. In Canada, Métis, First Nations, and Inuit. In Israel, there's the Palestinians who have a very solid claim to indigeneity, but I think Jews have another claim to indigeneity as well. So I don't tend to use the word indigenous in the context of Israel Palestine because it tends to operate as a trump card. And I have a different vision about how justice can be had for all.
We get into the discussion about the evolution of the term indigenous. Again, just as complicated as talking about the legal definition of genocide. You've spoken a couple of times about the importance of you having shared values. And I want to just explore that a little bit more. You've both worked on a project called Land for All. And the idea behind the project is that a two-state solution is workable, that there should be one homeland as a path for peace. And I wonder, as we as we watch what I mean, Israel has experienced the greatest loss of civilian life on one day in its entire history, and then on the other hand, the just a staggering, upsetting number of deaths, civilian deaths in Palestine going on right now. I wonder. There's a question from Andreas Serrell. I'll start with this with Omar. How do you see Palestinian politics evolving from this conflict?
So there's so much potentially to say on that front. I think that the first thing I'd like to say is that how the international community operates in this moment will play a role in determining what Palestinian politics looks like going forward. In order to understand where it's headed, it's important to sort of look a little bit backwards. The Palestinian national movement has been fragmented over the last number of years, and that fragmentation is a result not only of the fact that the West Bank and Gaza Strip have been ruled respectively by two different factions, Fatah and Hamas, but also because as a result of an array of policies that Israel has intentionally pursued, Palestinian political life has been fragmented in a range of other ways. And so the ability of the Palestinian Authority to exercise control over areas of the West Bank has been very substantially circumscribed, so that at present it exercises control over less than 20%, and even that is subject to Israeli incursions. And the sense that the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank has failed over the course of the last 20 years to to achieve Palestinian freedom, to create a space within which Palestinians can move freely, can build their institutions, has very, very profoundly undermined the legitimacy of that leadership. And so as we think about going forward, we've got to think about what steps we can take to facilitate the rebuilding of the Palestinian national movement, to reconnect the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, to enable the Palestine Liberation Organization, which at a certain juncture was a crucial provided umbrella under which many different Palestinian factions would operate, and a space for dialogue and decision-making about what the future of Palestinians should be. We need to similarly create space for the PLO to redevelop, including a space for the Islamist movements, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad, within that structure, so that they don't turn out to be spoilers that down the line prevent the realization of ideas like a land for all. And so I think to the extent that the international community says to Palestinians, like all other people, it's your right to choose your leaders. It's your right to have a space within which you are able to hold elections, move freely, live as citizens of your country. Um, if we facilitate all of that, I think that the Palestinian national movement stands a real chance of resurrection. What I'm afraid of is that the international community seems to be doing too little and obviously not very punctually, and could, through the kinds of policies that are being pursued right now, further create further fragmentation and deepen the attractiveness, increase the attractiveness of extremist ideologies.
Social media is never a good gauge of opinion. There's an awful lot of barking that goes on. But Mira, if I could ask you the same question. I mean, you talked about having difficult debates with your family members, and certainly your Facebook circle of Jewish Canadian and I'm sure Israeli Jewish friends as well. When you advocate for a two-state solution, I have seen, the accusation that is considered to be anti-Semitic. I mean, how difficult is it for you to have those conversations within the Jewish community that you represent?
Yes, it can be very difficult because looking at which group has the lion's share of the power. And by the way, I know in journalism school we all use the term lion's share incorrectly. So like all the power, but really the vast majority of the power between Israel and the Palestinians is the state of Israel, backed by the US. And so in my public discussions, I aim to do two things. One is to acknowledge the humanity of everybody. And I will often talk about in articles that I've written in The Walrus and elsewhere since October 7th, talking about friends and family in Israel by name and talking about what they went through. At the same time, I talk about the vast disparity of power between Israel and the Palestinians. And there is one group that can make change much more effectively than the other, given that Israel has a state and the Palestinians don't. And so people often in my community tend to think that I'm putting all the quote unquote blame on Israel. And so gets to be very difficult in terms of that we're not always talking about blame, but we're talking about what needs to happen in order to change the status quo. And also I should just add that it's not a conventional two-state solution that I support. And Omar is co-chair of the board of A Land for All, a movement known as A Land for All, Two States, One Homeland. And I'm on the American support group steering committee to support the efforts of A Land for All, which is a joint Israeli and Palestinian group. And it's a modified two-state solution. It is able to overcome two of the biggest stumbling blocks that the two-state solution, the conventional version, had foundered on, and that was Palestinian refugee return and the fate of the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. So under this plan, A Land for All, Israeli settlers could stay. They would become residents of a state of Palestine, and they would still vote for the Israeli parliament, the Knesset in West Jerusalem. Palestinian refugees could return to their cities and towns in Israel, in what has now become Israel. They would be residents of the state of Israel, and they would vote for Palestinian national elections in East Jerusalem or Ramallah or wherever the Palestinian capital ends up being. And Palestinian citizens of Israel would remain as citizens of Israel. They would not be denationalized. They would not be forced to give up their rights.
Thank you for clarifying that. And we've got about 5 minutes left. So I just want to share, and we've got some of our audience members are wondering if there will be a video for this. Yes, we're recording this right now, and we'll post the video on our Carleton websites and send it out to people that are interested in hearing more about the conversation. Historian Yuval Noah Harari was on CBC Radio yesterday, and he had an interesting comment to make about the Al Haram Al Sharif or the Temple Mount, in Jerusalem, and he said he was using it as the power of story, and how very much what is happening in his argument was that there are two powerful stories that are doing battle. He said essentially what is happening is people are fighting over a rock, and if you think about all of this bloodshed that's happening over a rock, then it doesn't make a lot of sense. If it's a sacred rock, then it becomes a different story, and you can see why people are fighting over it. I wondered, as I heard that, I wondered if what either one of you would think about that.
I think the role of religion is important, but I don't think it should be overstated. And so I think that there are impediments to Palestinians and Israelis enjoying, especially Palestinians, given the power disparity that I mentioned earlier. There are impediments to Palestinians and Israelis, but especially Palestinians, enjoying a life of freedom and dignity and safety that are separate and transcend religion. So, for example, Palestinians in the West Bank are subject to IDF shooting them. There are hundreds of Palestinians who have died in the West Bank from IDF open fire just since October 7th, and settler violence, for which the IDF enables or turns a blind eye. There is lack of freedom of movement within the West Bank for Palestinians because of the Israeli web of occupation and checkpoints, which serve to protect the settlements and separate the settlements from Palestinian communities. There is 5 million refugees at least, who have never been allowed to return. And none of that, and there are laws in Israel that discriminate against Palestinian citizens of Israel. So, and there's been a blockade on the Gaza Strip since 2007. And of course, now the genocidal type war. So none of that has anything to do with rocks in any sacred sense. They have to do with real areas of territory that people need to physically exist, because we are physical beings that need space, some degree of space anyway. So I think I wouldn't, I think it can be a little bit romantic or exciting for a scientist and historian like Harari to kind of have it all focused on rocks, and it makes it sound like the groups are just irrational. But I think there are some very, very legitimate claims that are embedded within international law and international ethics, and just basic sense of decency of what people need to live fulfilling and safe lives.
You hear the terms intractable, you hear the terms complex over and over again when it comes to this debate. I wonder if we could wrap up our evening this way, on a little bit of hope. When I look at the historical examples of atrocities that happened in Rwanda, the long-running conflict in Ireland, West and East Germany, South Africa, those are all, conflicts which also had difficult and complex histories, were also described as being intractable and complex. I wonder, for both of you, what gives you hope? I mean, this is a terrible. It's been a terrible 5 months, and it doesn't look like things are getting better. Are we going to see a continuation of this and yet another generation of conflict, or will peacemakers emerge? Omar, let me start with you.
So it's hard to be hopeful in a moment like this, but I think one has to both cling to hope and find ways of channeling it in constructive directions. We've been talking a little bit today about A Land for All, the movement that both Mira and I are involved with. And as Mira mentioned, I'm one of the members of the joint board. And this is a board that's comprised of an equal number of Palestinians from all across Israel Palestine and of Israeli Jews. And the board met for the first time on October 10th, 3 days, obviously, after October 7th. One could expect that in a moment like that, a meeting between Palestinians and Israelis would be filled with recriminations, but instead it was filled with sympathy and solidarity and the sense that there was more crucial and urgent work to do than ever. And I think the reason why the atmosphere was different at that meeting than in many other contexts in which Israelis and Palestinians have encountered each other since October 7th, and for that matter, beforehand, was because we had agreed to a political vision that was responsive to the needs and aspirations of both peoples. It wasn't a compromise vision that, like the Oslo version of the two-state solution, involved each people giving up things that were fundamental to it. Instead, it took seriously our the fact that both of us are attached to all the length and breadth of Israel Palestine, and also that issues like refugees and their right of return can't just be wished away. And so it gave me hope to see that when you engage the issues on the table seriously, that people of good faith can find a way together to move forward. And that feels hopeful, even if not necessarily a basis for optimism at this moment.
Last word to you, Mira.
I founded a little group on Facebook a couple of years ago, and it was for Jews who felt connected to Israel, but also wanted to engage in full-throated Palestine solidarity. And since October 7th, the numbers have doubled of this group. It's right now just on Facebook, but one day I hope it will exist out in the world. So we went from 500 to nearly 1,000. And it's called Drachim, which is the name of my favorite Israeli rock album from the 70s. So it's really, I mean, I think we're all living a delicate balancing act in some ways of maintaining trying to maintain our personal and communal relationships while speaking hard truths at times.
I want to thank you both for sharing your thoughts this evening. We talk about hope. It's inspiring the collaboration and the friendship that you have had and continue to have, and also your willingness and determination to keep on sharing the lessons of that. So thank you both, Omar and Mira, for spending the evening with us. And I know there's so many of in our audience who have been enjoying this conversation. Thank you to everyone who took time out of your busy evenings to join us on this Carleton Zoom, and thank you to the Faculty of Public Affairs at Carleton for hosting the evening. It is incredibly important. We pay lip service to dialogue. With this topic, it can be very difficult, but it's so important that we have these conversations. And I want to thank everyone who joined us this evening. Miigwech, and again, we'll be sharing the video when in a couple of days once it's all been processed, and please do feel free to share it with your friends and family so that they can continue on the conversation. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.